Did you know that David Bowie, one of the greatest musical artists of all time, once had a white witch conduct an exorcism on his possibly possessed pool? The life of David Bowie is perhaps one of the most fascinating journeys you'll find in the history of rock music. Beyond the storied career spanning half a century to the seemingly countless personas he embodied during it, and even the lore behind his final farewell in Black Star, Bowie always proved he was one step ahead of literally everyone. But beyond all the glam and the glamour, there were periods of immense darkness, drama, and even literal demons. And today we'll be digging into that story a bit. Hi, I'm Andy Fenstermaker, host of Poetic, a weekly music history series and podcast where I dig into the record collection I've been building since the 1990s to explore the sometimes little-known history of a band, album, or song from within. The mid-1970s were not a good time for Bowie. Having become immersed in American culture, he spiraled between New York and Los Angeles and Philadelphia before spiraling mentally and physically and then fleeing to Berlin with Iggy Pop to clean up. In my piece on the dark history surrounding young Americans, I touched briefly on Bowie's fascination with the occult, magic, and witchcraft during this period. And today we're going to expand on that dark snippet in his history and dig deeper into his paranoia and persona that followed. But first, let's look at diamond dogs, drugs, and departures. It was during the 1974 Diamond Dogs tour across the United States that Bowie's drug use escalated. Predominantly centered around coke, he lost a significant amount of weight, becoming gaunt and emaciated, causing physical debilitation and exacerbating paranoia and mania. This trend would extend into his Plastic Soul era, including the 1975 album Young Americans. And for more of that story, check the link in the description. Bowie would fire his manager, Tony DeFries, in a truly heinous severance agreement, which continued to pump DeFries' pockets with millions and millions of Bowie's earnings for decades to come. Biographer Christopher Sanford wrote that Bowie then, quote, shut himself up on West 20th Street, where for a week his howls could be heard through the locked attic door. In 1976, he'd record Station to Station, now fully embodying the Thin White Duke persona he had introduced the year prior.
Return of the Thin White Duke, throwing darts in lovers' eyes. Here am I, what magical movement, such is the stuff from where treaties are.
The character depicted the extraterrestrial Thomas Jerome Newton from the film The Man Who Fell to Earth, in which Bowie starred. After the release of Station to Station in January of 1976, Bowie toured in support of the album, his addiction continuing to escalate and cause problems before reaching a breaking point in August of that year. Pulling Iggy Pop out of an LA mental institution where he was recovering from his own addiction issues, the two fled to Berlin. About this period, Bowie would comment on the experience of the mid-1970s in a 1987 Musician magazine interview. It's quite a casualty case, isn't it? I'm amazed I came out of that period, honest. When I see that now, I cannot believe I survived it. I was so close to really throwing myself away, physically, completely. In early 1975, David Bowie relocated from New York to Los Angeles to take on the lead role in Nicholas Roeg's film adaptation of The Man Who Fell to Earth. Portraying the alien Thomas Jerome Newton, Bowie immersed himself in the character, which would be the basis for the Thin White Duke. During the film's production, he stayed with bassist Glenn Hughes of the band Deep Purple, often visiting Iggy Pop, who at the time was in rehab in a nearby mental institution. His increasing dependence on substances led further and further into erratic behavior and a deteriorating mental state. Reflecting on their time together, Hughes recalled Bowie's unpredictable behavior, influenced by his heavy drug use. Bowie stopped using elevators due to his fear of heights. and his addiction ended friendships with other musicians, including Keith Moon of The Who, John Lennon, and Harry Nilsson. Bowie would later state that, quote, "If you really want to lose all your friends and all the relationships you ever held dear, cocaine is the drug to do it with." And then there was Jimmy Page. David Bowie, Jimmy Page, two rock icons, each pushing the limits of music, and art, and the occult. Bowie would become utterly terrified of Page, so much so that he spent the mid-70s convinced the Led Zeppelin guitarist was using dark magic against him. By 1975, Bowie's obsession with the occult, Aleister Crowley, Kabbalah, ritual magic, was at its height, all fueled by his addiction. His mind was a swirl of esoteric texts and of drug-fueled visions. Page, too, was no stranger to the dark arts. He had bought the infamous Scottish estate once owned by Aleister Crowley himself. Crowley, a man known for his bizarre and sometimes terrifying magical practices. Page even owned an occult bookstore in London, stocked with rare and arcane texts. Bowie, fascinated by this magical, mythical underworld, was initially intrigued by Page, but the fascination soon turned to terror. Bowie became convinced that some dark force, was watching him, and he believed that Page was using his magic against him, cursing him from afar. His paranoia spiraled out of control. He lined the windows of his home with protective symbols. He kept bowls and jars of his own urine around the house. He thought if Page got a hold of it, or some of these demons or aliens or whatever these things were, they would use it against him. This wasn't just a passing fear. Bowie was genuinely terrified. He refused to see Page. He severed all contact, and when friends tried to reassure him that nothing was going on, he wouldn't hear it. He believed he was being watched, manipulated, and maybe even hunted. By the time he fled Los Angeles with Iggy Pop in 1976, the damage was done. He never spoke to Jimmy Page again. Was it drugs? Delusion? Or did Bowie truly see something lurking in the shadows? Or his pool? Whatever the truth, one thing is clear. Bowie believed he was in danger, and he believed Jimmy Page was behind it. And that brings us to the paranormal, demon-possessed pool. Bowie's increasing obsession with the occult, mysticism, and supernatural forces came at a monumental cost. He was deep in this period of paranoia, convinced that unseen dark entities were influencing his life. According to biographer Peter Doggett, writer of The Man Who Sold the World, David Bowie in the 1970s, Bowie believed his home was haunted and filled with negative energy. He began drawing protective pentagrams on the walls and engaged in rituals to ward off spirits and seeking other methods to shield himself from dark entities. It was common to see books like Psychic Self-Defense by Dion Fortune scattered across his home, looking to white magic to counter those evil dark forces. But one particular incident pushed his fears to a breaking point. Shortly after moving into 637 North Doheny Drive in Beverly Hills, he became convinced that his pool was possessed. Bowie and his then-wife Angie recounted that strange, inexplicable phenomena centered around the pool. Objects would move on their own. Shadows seemed to shift unnaturally, and most disturbingly, Bowie claimed to have seen a dark figure rising from the water. According to Angie's 1993 memoir, Backstage Passes, Life on the Wild Side with David Bowie, she walked outside one evening to find Bowie in a state of absolute terror. He insisted that something sinister was in the water, something beyond explanation. Angie wrote that she saw a form rising up through the pool, which deeply unsettled them both. The couple, already immersed in occult beliefs, decided that a drastic action was necessary. Speaking with Dylan Jones for the book David Bowie, A Life, Glenn Hughes would say, he felt his pool in his LA home was haunted. He felt the devil was in the pool. The wind was howling, and the pool started to bubble like a jacuzzi. I swear to you, I have a pool, and I have never seen it bubble before. That pool was freaking bubbling. Sure, maybe you can blame the drugs, but Hughes would continue. On coke, you could talk yourself into seeing anything. Bowie believed it was Satan himself rising from the water. Desperate to rid the house of its dark energy, Bowie sought out the services of the self-proclaimed White Witch of New York to perform an exorcism. This person, Wally Elmlark, arrived at the house and conducted a cleansing ritual, complete with incantations and holy water. According to Angie, as the ritual was performed, she and Bowie both saw strange, swirling shapes in the water, as if an unseen force was recanting violently to the purification process. Angie later recalled in backstage passes that Bowie was deeply shaken by what he witnessed, convinced that real supernatural forces were at play. After the ritual, the disturbances reportedly stopped, but Bowie wouldn't remain in LA for long. It was shortly after this incident that Bowie left Los Angeles altogether, seeking an escape from paranoia, from drug use, from the paranormal, and from the occult fascinations that had consumed him. He relocated to Berlin in 1976, where he underwent a personal and creative transformation, leaving behind the excesses of his LA years. The events surrounding the exorcism of the pool became one of the most infamous and bizarre stories from this era of his life. Could the infamous Jimmy Page of Led Zeppelin have really cast dark forces on Bowie during this time? Was it all drug-induced hallucinations? Or, as time passes, has the story just become as exaggerated and contorted as the figures Bowie saw emerging from the pool? Regardless, Bowie himself was deeply affected by the experience. Whether a supernatural encounter or a manifestation of his deteriorating mental state, the exorcism of David Bowie's swimming pool remains one of rock history's most eerie and most intriguing legends.